Hello, welcome to I'm a Neurodivergent, chapter 34 of 52, recapping my unexpected autism and ADHD year week by week. Happy Christmas Eve still, this is festive. I'm going to focus my next few videos specifically on ADHD, which I haven't really done so far, despite it being 50% of my neurodivergent pizza toppings. But it was only a good few months in that we realised ADHD was also going on with me on top of my autism, which it does for so many people. And that having both is increasingly known as AuDHD, and it's way more common than previously thought. So ADHD is going to be the specific focus of these videos for this next little bit. For anyone new to this channel, I got my autism diagnosis in March of 2022 at 44, while it made a hell of a lot of sense of a lot of things that had never made sense in my life before. It hadn't made sense of everything. And after about 3 or 4 different therapists or autism coaches told me they thought ADHD might also be going on with me, and I discussed the possibility with my NHS psychiatrist, I finally got formally referred for an ADHD diagnosis later in 2022. By this point, various experts had said that while they definitely agreed I was autistic, they also commented that I often talked very fast when in a flow, have very associative, or what have been described by others as quite random thought processes, that I go on kind of intellectual tangents that I realise I'm going on and flag to others to try to help them stay with me. And that I had a history, particularly in my younger days, of making impulsive or spontaneous decisions based on a need for novelty or new experiences, which directly contradicted my autistic need for routine and repetitive behaviours, which in their opinion were all, at minimum, very ADHD adjacent, at least. And I think what clinched it for getting the formal referral was the way I described having these two voices inside my brain all the time, one continually shouting kind of idea, travel, book idea, new career move, and another voice shouting like routine, status quo, predictability, and that they scream at each other and exhaust me before I've even attempted to do anything. So my NHS psychiatrist referred me for an assessment, and we discussed how it was becoming increasingly common to get dual ASD and ADHD diagnoses, particularly in late diagnosed people, because having both aspects can in some ways cancel out individual traits of either, while at the same time doubling down on traits of both, which can lead to milder external presentations of either autism or ADHD, but increased internal levels of stress and anxiety. I then started looking more into ADHD because all my focus had thus far been on autism, and I started seeing more and more I recognised, including a really good way of describing it, and I'll link to a Facebook video of that in the video description, as thinking of it not as an attention deficit disorder, but an intention deficit disorder, an inability of being able to accomplish all of the things you intend to do, because future states only become conceivable and real when they're right in front of your face. And there's a kind of crisis to deal with things now rather than an instinct to carefully plan for those things. You can have accumulated all the knowledge in the world in the back part of your brain, but ADHD is a performance-related disorder in the front part of your brain that doesn't allow you to do the things you know how to do. So that was an immediate yes, and I kind of realised I needed to actually start to properly understand ADHD the way I delved into understanding autism a few months previously. And I found a similar free month-long course on ADHD on the FutureLearn website to help me do just that. And again, I'll link to the FutureLearn course in the video description. And similar to what I did with the Understanding Autism course, I'm just going to go through my course notes and relay what I learned about ADHD and reflect on that through my own experiences, because that's where I was at on my own neurodivergent discovery journey at this stage, pretty much 8 months into that first year. So, understanding ADHD. Week 1 of the course basically looked at what is ADHD. The course is introduced by Dr. Mark Kennedy from King's College London's Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, and his teaching team at the time, as well as other academics, as well as people with lived experience of ADHD, both late diagnosis and parents of ADHD kids. So he starts off by saying the stereotype of an ADHD kid, typically male, running around the classroom, is not the starting point anymore. And the ADHD is way more complex and nuanced than that. And understanding those nuances are essential for creating better outcomes for huge ranges of people from different backgrounds and different situations with ADHD, whether they know they're ADHD or not. So everyone struggles to pay attention sometimes, yes. Everyone feels bursts of energy that can feel hard to know what to do with sometimes. So how does ADHD differ from that? Because basically when you have ADHD, these things don't affect you every once in a while. They're with you and affecting you all the time, 24/7. And the course looks at the history of ADHD briefly, which was really interesting. So like autism and other neurodivergent conditions, it's always been around and part of the human condition. We just didn't always have the words or the understanding to describe it. ADHD is not a new phenomenon. It's been recognized as capital letters a thing for over 100 years. There are references in the 18th and 19th centuries to patterns of inattention, difficulty concentrating, and impulsive lack of control. And an article from The Lancet in 1902 sets out what would pretty much become the current ADHD symptom profile for children, which grew during the course of the 20th century to be a specific childhood, quote-unquote, disorder, classified in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which by the late 20th century had settled into subtypes of inattentive ADHD, hyperactive-impulsive ADHD, or combined ADHD, the latter of which is what I ended up getting a diagnosis of. So ADHD is probably best understood as a set of behaviours grouped into 3, what the course refers to as domains. So 1, inattention. So concentration ability, a tendency to be easily distracted and struggle to stay focused over a period of time, particularly on things that don't interest you. 2, impulsivity, acting on impulse before thinking and reflecting, basically. And 3, hyperactivity, so squirming, fidgeting, swaying, general difficulties being still. Everybody has elements of these 3 traits, yes, but when these domain traits begin to dominate your experience and impact your everyday life, that's when ADHD becomes more and more likely. The 3 domains of ADHD are often referred to as presentations and can often ebb and flow in terms of severity and impact. If you're predominantly inattentive ADHD, your core challenge is basically that you can't concentrate, you're easily distracted, you can't sustain focus on a task. If you were ever referred to as a shy kid, a daydreamer, a space cadet, have a think about inattentive ADHD and take a look at the self-test that I post in most of the descriptions to these videos. If you're predominantly hyperactive or impulsive, your core challenge is that you're always on the go. You can't relax, impatient, waiting for outcomes, unable to delay gratification, often act without thinking first, and are constantly fidgeting. And the combined type is a fun combo of both. Throw autism in there as well, and you've got the particularly spicy neuro profile I've talked about in my previous few videos. It's generally, the course says, diagnosed in primary school, or at least is more these days, thankfully, age 6 or 7, are broadly when demands start to become more at school, and the corresponding reaction to those demands can start to affect a child with ADHD. For particularly severe ADHD, and yes, ADHD is a spectrum condition, much like autism, the presence and challenge of ADHD can be obvious much earlier than this too, in terms of like impulsivity, activity, emotional and behavioral regulation. It was only relatively recently that adult ADHD became a thing, but it wasn't just a childhood thing that kids grew out of when studies of kids diagnosed with ADHD were followed up on in adulthood. And it was seen that those traits still existed and presented ongoing challenges, that you don't just grow out of ADHD. It was a lifelong condition where ADHD people's brains just work in fundamentally different ways to the majority. And often adults who were maybe minimally impacted by ADHD in childhood suddenly find in adulthood jobs, family, etc., where executive functioning skills are more demanded, that you're suddenly floored by things that other people seem to be finding easy. And this was briefly considered, the course sets out, to be some sort of adult onset ADHD, but it's not. It's really just a reflection of a lifetime condition being challenged in different ways at different times of your life by whatever external environment you're facing. And the ADHD was always there. It was just undiagnosed or unrecognized. I've talked previously about autism plus environment equals outcome, and the same is equally true of ADHD. ADHD plus environment equals outcome. In a conducive environment, ADHD brains can bring huge amounts of positives. In a non-conducive environment, the world will trip up and kick the shit out of ADHD brains. My summary, not the course's. What the course does say is that ADHDers who went undiagnosed as kids learn to control their restlessness and overactivity and use adaptive skills to reduce the impact of ADHD on their everyday lives to greater or lesser extents. I've talked about autistic masking. This is ADHD masking. There's a lot of crossover. It's all neurodivergence, despite the differing presentations. The impulsivity and hyperactivity is easier to learn to control as an adult in many ways. Impatience with waiting in queues being an obvious exception. But the inattentiveness, if that's your ADHD sprinkle, is not. Distractibility, avoidance of tasks that require sustained attention, being disorganized, problems initiating or completing tasks, being forgetful, and being able to hyper-focus on things you enjoy, but unable to focus on important but mundane tasks, getting bored easily, your mind going at 100 miles an hour all the time, flitting from thought to thought to thought without brakes on, different thoughts layering on top of each other and overwhelming your brain with complete overload, leaving you unable to do basic things like reading or watching TV or even following a conversation. Those things can be masked as well, of course, but they shred you, and you start to hate yourself over time if you don't know what it is or why it's happening. From personal experience, in the period between realizing I almost certainly had ADHD on top of my autism, one of the therapists I was seeing said to me, "You're quite a self-contained, content autistic person. It's your ADHD that's killing you." And I don't know that I 100% agree with that assessment. I think they were both killing me in different ways before I knew what they were and how to manage them to my advantage a bit better. But there's a kernel of truth there. Certainly in my professional life, and arguably my personal too, masking and suppressing my ADHD traits for so long and having to live off rigid spreadsheets and routines just to survive was killing me. Emotional instability is another key challenge of ADHD, whatever age you are. When you're ADHD, you find you get easily irritable, frustrated or angry, low self-esteem, sleep problems, you have frequent mood swings within very short time periods. The emotional instability is often the aspect that manifests itself most visibly to others, and because you mask the other stuff, it's often why ADHD so often gets misdiagnosed as other things like anxiety, depression, or even bipolar disorder or BPD. If the emotional regulation issues are there with a lot of the other stuff that's less obvious, it could well just be ADHD, which is why adult ADHD assessments look back at how you were as a kid as well as how you are as an adult to see if there are clear through lines. I'll do a separate video in future on what an adult ADHD assessment looks like, having now gone through one and nailed it, severe combined ADHD, boom. But the problem is just getting more adults assessed who are struggling but don't know why, who are quote unquote coping but not really. Mental health professionals, GPs and therapists need to get so much better at getting this stuff right the first time, not years later after people have compounded damage upon themselves by pushing themselves through the wrong lives for themselves, because no one had been able to correctly identify what was going on with them. Actually, do you know what? The course notes do list out the DSM criteria for ADHD diagnoses. I was really trying to make these ADHD videos shorter than some of my more recent really long ones because know your audience, right? But I think it'd be helpful for completeness to run through the list of quote-unquote symptoms. And just on that, everything when you're talking diagnostics is about challenges and impairments, etc., etc. Because that's how you get a diagnosis. There are so many positives to being ADHD and so many advantages. And being ADHD is in many ways like winning the lottery. Like if you're ADHD, I bet no one has ever told you you're boring, right? Unless you force yourself into a boring box because you haven't known. But innately you, for all your other messes, you will not be boring. And I'm also going to do a future video on the positives of ADHD because much like the positives of autism, these get brushed over and ignored way too much. Anyway, I'm just going to read these diagnostic criteria where for a diagnosis you need to show a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity, or both if you've got combined type, that interferes or has interfered with functioning or development. So for inattention type ADHD, 6 or more of these 9 symptoms need to be met for kids and 5 for adults. 1, often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes at school or work or with other activities. And if not all these things ring true, as this one didn't for me, for example, be aware that if you've got other neurodivergent sprinkles, such as autism, these can take over and mitigate. That's why you only need to meet 5 out of 9 to qualify for an adult ADHD diagnosis as well. 2, often has trouble holding attention on tasks or activities. 3, often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. So for me, I cannot listen to like driving directions. I cannot recall verbal work instructions if not written down. They just vanish. It's why I have notebooks filled up with notes from every conversation I have. 4, often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish work, chores or duties, e.g. loses focus, gets sidetracked. 5, often has trouble organising tasks and activities. 6, often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to do tasks that require mental effort over a longer period of time, i.e. Chronic procrastination of difficult things. 7, often loses things necessary for tasks and activities like school materials, pencils, books, tools, wallets, keys, paperwork, glasses, phones. 8 is often easily distracted, and 9 is often forgetful in daily activities. For hyperactivity and impulsivity type ADHD, again, 6 or more symptoms for kids, 5 or more for adults to meet diagnostic thresholds for the second subtype. 1 often fidgets with or taps hands or feet or squirms in seat. Yep. 2 often leaves seat in situations when remaining seated is expected. So for me, I don't do this at work because I know it's weird, but at home, I'm constantly getting up and pacing around and sliding on the floor or spinning around in the middle of a task and then sitting down again. 3 often runs about or climbs in situations where it's not appropriate. This is more of a kids one, I'd say. Teens and adults may be limited to feeling restless but not necessarily acting on it, because you do learn to control impulses. 4, often unable to take part in leisure activities or play quietly. 5 is often on the go, acting as if driven by a motor. So yes to that one. And I talked about feeling like there was a motor in me, leaving me unable to relax for years before ADHD or neurodivergence was even on my radar. I'd even said most of the people I like and connect with feel like they have a motor, where they're always slightly uncomfortable with themselves and slightly uncomfortable with the world around them. I find it very difficult to relax and just sit down and watch a film or read a book, particularly if it's not a film I've chosen to watch with intention. And when I'm on my own, I'm constantly on my laptop until the point of exhaustion. Very rarely stop to eat or just chill or go to bed, even if the activity I'm doing is largely pointless. 6, often talks excessively. So again, for me, yes, I will babble in meetings and dominate conversations, particularly when I'm nervous or feel like a spotlight on me. 7, often blurts out an answer before a question has been completed. 8, often has trouble waiting his or her turn. Again, for me, I'll lose the thread of conversations because I've thought of something I need to say and keep repeating it in my head until I can interject so I don't forget, because once a thought's been supplanted, it's often just gone and unrecoverable. And the 9th one was often interrupts or intrudes on others, e.g. butts into conversations or activities. That's pretty similar. If you meet the criteria for both the inattentive and the hyperactive-impulsive subtypes, you have what I said earlier, what's known as combined ADHD, which is me. And for an adult diagnosis, the assessor needs to be satisfied the symptoms were present in childhood as well as in adulthood and have a significant impact on your day-to-day function and well-being. The course talks about how common ADHD is. At the time of writing, the stats were that around 5% of kids and 3% of adults met diagnostic criteria, the difference between the two being primarily around masking and coping strategies. So ADHD is significantly more common in the general population than autism, which is about 1 to 2%. It looks at diagnosis rates across the world and how ADHD has been significantly overdiagnosed in the US, because it's diagnosed by primary care physicians and because there's more awareness of inattentive type ADHD there, and significantly underdiagnosed in the UK and across Europe historically, where it's typically been seen more as a disruptive behavioural problem, and it's broadly harder to get a referral and treatment here, and then only after clinical assessment by a specialist. The underdiagnosis, and more importantly, lack of intervention and support for ADHD in the UK has consequences. So 25% of prisoners have ADHD, 15% of those presenting to mental health services have ADHD, 12% of those with drug addiction disorders have ADHD, all far higher than general rates of incidence in the population. ADHD plus environment equals outcome. Shit environment, shit outcome. It also mentions, as with autism, that girls with ADHD remain significantly underdiagnosed, particularly with inattentive type ADHD, because they're generally less disruptive compared to boys. And inattentive ADHD is often misdiagnosed as depression or anxiety or emotional dysregulation. And the course notes some studies suggesting girls and women may be more prone to inattentive ADHD, boys and men to hyperactive-impulsive ADHD, meaning girls are generally less troublesome for parents and teachers than boys. But those studies aren't conclusive enough yet to say that's definitely a factor, one way or the other. It is quite interesting though, and there's a broad admission that the DSM criteria for both autism and ADHD actually has been generally based more on observations of male presentation than female presentation. So there's so much more work and research to do here to level the male-female playing field. It slightly evens out in adult diagnoses. Studies suggest with women more likely to present themselves for adult assessments than adult males, but there's still way too much of a bias towards male identification and assessment overall. On the worldwide stats, the course doesn't even mention Africa or Asia when it talks about global diagnosis rates, which is quelle surprise, I guess. The US, UK and Europe are the world. I suppose my assumption would have to be similar rates of incidence of ADHD anywhere in the world, but low to zero rates of recognition, accommodation and diagnosis in many places. But yeah, my summary and conclusions, not the courses, because they just didn't think worth mentioning the rest of the world. Another important thing the course talks about is ADHD in the brain and the neuroscience of it. And they get more into the brain and neuroscience in the third week of this 4-week course, and I will too in a couple of videos' time. But in summary, MRI scans do show fundamental differences in ADHD brains from neurotypical brains. They're medically described as brain abnormalities, but yikes. Interpretations may vary and will very much continue to. The explanation in the course likens brain structure to computer hardware and brain function to computer software. And neuroimaging research shows fundamental differences in both brain structure and brain function between ADHD and non-ADHD brains. This was really important research in the 90s in the development of identifying ADHD as a capital letters real thing, as it had often previously been dismissed as just medicalizing naughty children or as bad parenting, and then medicating lively or eccentric kids into dullness or normality, which happened. So the neuroimaging has helped, but the fact it's still referred to as a neurodevelopmental disorder, not just a neurodevelopmental difference, like so much achieved, so much still to accomplish. Neuroimaging also shows that ADHD brains take longer to quote-unquote mature than non-ADHD brains in terms of synaptic connections not grouping together, and those that aren't used not dying off. Like ADHD thinking stays very associative and less linear, basically. I mean, call that childlike thinking or call that creativity, tomato, but impairment or abnormality or deficit, like challenge, sure, in a linear, non-associative world, but those negative descriptors are all pretty tough sells for me, knowing what I know now. And we'll get back into this more in a couple of weeks with frontal lobes and basal ganglias and limbic systems and neurotransmitter systems and dopamine and noradrenaline, and how this all affects cognition and forward planning and working memory and time management and emotional regulation and motivation and all that stuff. Because week 1 of the course was just a kind of broadish intro, but I find it all really interesting to get into and reflect on, and it's still quite ignorantly framed in the general discourse about ADHD, including in the media, if I'm honest. What else? The course also touches on comorbidities in week 1, or co-occurring conditions, which was similarly mentioned in the Understanding Autism course. The majority of ADHD diagnoses exist in parallel with something else. Again, the same as autism. It goes back to I mentioned a while back in the autism videos, that quote, neurodiversity is like a pizza, it rarely comes with just one topping, and obviously that remains just as true for ADHD as for other neurodivergent conditions. It's why one person's presentation with ADHD may look absolutely nothing like another person's presentation with ADHD. And much like autism, ADHD is a spectrum condition and influenced by other things going on with the person as well. In kids, it tends to be related behavioural problems like ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, seems to co-occur with ADHD in up to 80% of cases. As kids get older, anxiety and depression becomes a huge crossover. Attachment disorders and rejection sensitivity are also really commonly found alongside ADHD. And signpost, I'm definitely going to do a separate video on rejection sensitivity because that's definitely battered me throughout my life, as it does a lot of ADHDers. And the kind of final module the course looks at in week 1 is outcomes for ADHD in adults. ADHD plus environment equals outcome again. And it's kind of depressing reading going back through my notes on this. Like inattentiveness, which is now looking like the more common of the subtypes, generally leads to poorer or inconsistent academic performance than would otherwise be the case with support and intervention, even accounting for IQ and social class, etc., etc. And that rolls on into work settings with broad underachievement, frustration, and self-esteem issues in adulthood. For the impulsivity subtype, outcomes around behaviour, emotional regulation, anger management, poor decisions, troubled relationships, and substance abuse are pretty common. That's not to say it's always the case, obviously, just that it happens. Many people with ADHD, quote unquote, do fine because they develop workarounds, generating, like, for example, dopamine hits by being interesting, being attractive, being bright, being sociable, and finding motivation in ways that make us feel good about ourselves. There's an interesting case study that they finish up on of a woman called Catherine who got a late ADHD diagnosis at 40, and after her husband also got a late diagnosis, and she then saw it in herself, having had no idea what neurodiversity was much before that point. She'd been diagnosed with anxiety previously as a teen, and then with depression at university, which had affected her throughout her 20s and 30s as well. And for her, it took her husband's adult diagnosis to get her own, and now her kids are both being assessed and likely ADHD as well, because ADHD, like autism, also tends to run in families. So yeah, the first week of the course, it concludes with a recommendation to speak to your GP, if any of this is ringing true, with a link to NHS NICE guidelines and other links, all of which I'll pop in the video description for easy access and reference, as well as links to the course itself and the ADHD Self-Test that I link to in most of my videos. So that's a fast-ish run through of week 1 of the Understanding ADHD course that I took. I hope it was interesting, and I'll be back with a few more of these specifically on ADHD, and then a few more on how ADHD and autism can bump uglies and create weird, wonderful people out of that unholy union. Please do like, subscribe, all that stuff if you found this useful, and yeah, see you next time. Cheers and happy almost Christmas.